Okay,
Pretty
we are live. All right. Welcome everyone. We are here at the Jump Search Talent Show Recruiter Revealed Series, episode 2. And for those of you that are in studio here, please drop where you're from, as well as any questions you may have in the chat. And we will try to do our best to address folks' questions. I'm also going to be monitoring people's questions in the LinkedIn Live. Hello, all. And we're running a special here. For Jump Search, we help connect talent and opportunities. And, one of the big things that folks have challenges with in their job search is just not getting feedback. Not getting feedback on their resume, not getting feedback on their interviews. And so if you want the real deal as far as real feedback from a real recruiter, $99 will give you a resume review as well as $99 for a mock interview. And this is one of the best ways to get feedback because a lot of times, you're going into an interview and, sometimes you're not hearing from the recruiter or the company. And even if you do, a lot of times they're not giving you the candidate feedback that you need to improve. So we're willing to do that and help you get on the right trajectory. All right. So today we have a special guest, Daniel Benavides from Recursion. And we are going to dive deep into a bunch of questions. And again, for all of you out there, just give a little bit of background on kind of what prompted this Recruiter Revealed series. I work with a lot of job seekers, and one of the big questions or sources of frustration is just having to work with a recruiter and how they operate and not hearing back, and the whole job interview process is just such a black box, and nobody knows what's going on. And I thought, you know what, if we could bring together some folks like Daniel, and we could sort of shed some insight into what's going on behind the scenes, how recruiters think, how interview processes are designed, what to expect from a recruiter, how to partner with them, how to connect with them, what the differences in the different kinds of recruiters there are out there. A little bit of knowledge will go so far in terms of helping job seekers really navigate the job search process, because we know it could be so frustrating and just a wild roller coaster of ups and downs. So that's sort of the premise behind this. And we have a bunch of questions that we've ingested from a number of different folks. But if you have any questions, drop it into the chat, and we'll try to get to it here. All right. Without further ado, we want to welcome Daniel and Michelle. If you want to kick it off, let's get this party started.
Yeah. And speaking of parties, I know this is before Christmas, so I like to wear my ugly sweater. It's probably one of the cuter sweaters because it has a little
I forgot mine.
reindeer.
I know. If I knew there was a dress code, Michelle, I would have worn. I have a great Christmas sweater.
Oh, shoot. Should have had you do it. Oh,
I know.
We're going to have to do it on the part 2.
Yeah, next year. Yeah, absolutely. Part 2. Because I know we're going to get into way too much that there's going to have to be a part 2. So
okay. We're going to do part 2, an ugly sweater party as well.
Perfect.
Well, I want to give you guys a little intro on Daniel. So funny enough, I have known Daniel for 5 years. We didn't realize that. We were laughing about how long we've known each other. And I want to say Daniel is one of the trustworthy recruiters that we've known. So he was on the top of our list when we were thinking of recruiters to invite on this mini series. And I have also worked with Daniel as his recruiter. So that's also a little funny tip there.
Full circle, right, Michelle?
It is full circle
moment. I love it. Yeah.
So, but I mean, what's been impressive for me when I met Daniel was really, just you building out Ancestry, their D&I program, diversity, inclusion. I might be butchering the title on this, but I don't see a lot of people who get it and build out these programs, and especially how it's running to today. You can kind of share a little bit about that, but let me give you a little background on Daniel. So he started his recruiting career over 10 years ago, and fell into recruiting almost like every other recruiter. I did as well. And Daniel was an analyst for years before joining recruiting, and he thought he found his sweet spot with Excel. But that changed when he first started. I think moving into kind of recruiting, and he's able to bridge that love for people and data. And now he is the director of talent acquisition and people operations at Recursion. So born and raised in Utah, he loves to ski, hike, and spend as much time with his golden retriever, Cosmo, and husband, Nathan. So welcome,
Awesome.
Daniel.
Thank you, Michelle. Absolutely. And those listening, I paid Michelle to say all of those wonderful things about me. So it was, I'll put the check in the mail, Michelle, when we're done. I'll make sure.
Well, thank you.
I'll overnight that to you. Absolutely. Now, and Eric, I didn't realize that this was only the second session of this mini series. I'm honored to be a part of this. Thank you so much for having me. I think it'll be a great session today. So I'm looking forward to that. And Michelle, thank you for all the kind things. And it was so funny as we were getting started, just realizing that I was like, oh, I've known Michelle for like 6 months. Right. And then it was like, no, it is 5 years. When you said 2018, I was shocked. I did not realize it was that long ago. So back when I was at Ancestry. And so, as you mentioned, Michelle, I've been able to do a lot throughout my career. I thought I was an analyst. I love data. I love analytics. And then I fell into recruiting, and then it just kind of blossomed from there, and incredibly passionate about all things diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, or DEIB is what you'll see in the space right now. And, building our employee resource group program at Ancestry, taking that to CHG. And then right now at Recursion, I also lead our internal inclusion council, where we're focusing on just making sure everything is inclusive from the environment, our systems, our policies, the way we're recruiting, the way we are outreaching to folks, like all of those kind of things. And then we actually just kicked off 2 ERGs at Recursion this year. And ERG, I'll stop, is a employee resource group. So groups of employees that can kind of come together with shared experiences, making sure that they have the resources and tools and all of those kind of things to set them up for success, and that the environment is welcoming and people can show up as their true authentic self. So that, on top of recruiting and just being able to do all of those kind of things there. So
you got your hands
super I do a lot. I have a good friend of mine she's like, what are you doing? I was, working, doing these types of things. She's like, there are not enough hours in the day for the things that you do. And I love it. What's that phrase around, you never work a day in your life if you love what you do. And I love what I do from the perspective of recruiting, helping people, diversity, equity, and inclusion, making sure people can bring their true authentic self to work every day. Like, that is just, no one should ever feel less than. And I'm incredibly passionate about that. And it's the right thing to do. So I love that space. So
yeah. We'd love to get into this. I think you have a wealth of knowledge, and I think this would also help with job seekers in trying to understand how this whole D&I works on the recruiting front.
Yeah. Happy to dig into that. Absolutely. Yeah. And Michelle, one thing I will just mention is, you mentioned like the recruiting black hole. As a recruiting professional, the recruiting black hole is my biggest pet peeve of our process. So anything that we can do as recruiters to kind of adjust that and fix that, I would love to dig into that today too. So super excited to get into all of this.
Actually, I was going to say, do you want to kick that off? I'm going to look to Eric in terms of, I know you have the list of questions and topics we want to get into first.
Yeah.
And reminder, audience, drop in your questions. We will do our best to answer it, and we will be monitoring the chat. So feel free to drop in your questions.
All right. Well, Daniel, let's just start with the basics real quick. What is a recruiter, and why do they exist? What do they do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would hope that as a recruiter, there are some people that I meet sometimes that are recruiters that I'm like, that is why our space gets such a bad name. Because I'm like, it's not that hard to be a good recruiter. But anyway, that aside, I'll get off my soapbox. So to me, a recruiter is, and you've got a different types of recruiters, right? That I think we'll talk about throughout this. Is you've got headhunters, you have external recruiters, you have agency recruiters, you have in-house recruiters, and those types of things. And all of my experience throughout my recruiting career has been in-house. And what I mean by that is I am employed by companies so I'm a W-2 employee for a company to find and recruit talent to join their team. So my role is to partner and work with hiring managers, partner with the organization to just ensure that we are bringing the right people into the right role every single time, right? And so I will always say a great recruiter is as good as the relationships that they can build with their candidates. So all of you listening, folks that are out there, job seekers, those kind of things, in addition to the hiring managers that they're working with too. Because if you do not, as a recruiter, if you don't understand the role, the aspect of what you're going out to find, how are you then supposed to kind of engage with candidates and kind of create those relationships to move folks forward? So boiling all that down, to me, a recruiter is somebody that's going out, connecting with folks, finding people and pulling them in, and just kind of shepherding them throughout the recruitment process, from phone screens to hiring manager calls to interviews, all the way up to offer. And then we pass that off to whatever system kind of comes next, which is generally your people operations or HR teams from there.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, Michelle and I have most of our experiences in external recruiting, so I think we'll bring a nice balance of perspective, as we start to entertain some of these questions. But what are your thoughts, Daniel, in terms of how job seekers out there can spark and further relationships with a recruiter? A lot of folks are just starting their job search, and a lot of them don't have existing relationships with a recruiter, and so how would you go about fostering those relationships?
Yeah, I can tell. I will start, Eric. This is recency bias because this just happened yesterday. I will tell you what not to do first, and then I'll get into what to do. So,
I'd love to hear that.
There was we had a candidate yesterday. Right now is kind of high volume recruiting with, internship roles, those types of things. So there's a lot of companies right now that in the fall, winter season, they do a lot of internship hiring. And so there was a candidate that we were kind of connecting with, and I think they had received another offer or something along those lines. And this was a couple of weeks ago, had received another offer, and they had reached out to every member of the recruiting team, myself included, every member of the recruiting team, sent us all like 5 or 6 messages, called us, left us voicemails, sent us messages on LinkedIn and all of these types of things around just like, what's the update? Where are things? And all of those kind of things. And don't get me wrong, like I appreciate the tenacity and kind of the outreach, but I think that's a step too far, right? Like I think there's a couple of things where you can kind of just reach out, hey, just a little nudge, all of those kind of things. And I get there are times we get so many emails and all of those kind of things, but to kind of put the entire team on blast, the company, all of those kind of things, it was less than ideal. So it kind of just left a bad taste in our mouth. So that is one way that I would kind of say that is not a great way to create a relationship, because it's like, hold on a minute. But I think the other thing on the other side around just kind of ways that you can create a relationship, I think is because it's a, what's the word I'm looking for? Is it's often behind the black wall, the wall of, your application, all those kind of things, right? You don't see a name, right? If I post a job, or if somebody on my team posts a job, you don't say like, oh, Susie, this recruiter posted this job, or Michelle or Eric posted this job. So you often don't see a lot of those types of things. One thing I always recommend doing is that there are very easy keyword searches. Even if you don't have LinkedIn Premium, you can just search like, who's a recruiter at Facebook? Who's a recruiter at Comcast? Who's a recruiter here? Depending on how big the company is, right? Some companies may have 50,000 recruiters. Some companies may have 2, but it still kind of gets you in to kind of create that aspect of things, to kind of say like, hey, I haven't heard anything. I haven't, where is this? And all of those kind of things. And I appreciate that kind of reach out, just as long as it's not 60 times, it's maybe just 1 or 2 times. I'm fine with that. But then I think once you kind of can get your in and creating that relationship, and I like this question, Eric, because, and Michelle, you alluded to this, like Michelle and I started talking in 2018. There was a job, I was offered a job. It didn't work out. Michelle and I stayed in touch for a variety of years. And 2 years later, Michelle, so late 2020, Michelle and I just stayed in contact, and Michelle came back. Hey, I have this, there's an opportunity for you here. And the rest is history. And that's my role at Recursion. And Michelle helped place me here at Recursion. And so that all said, just being able to, if you have a contact, just staying in touch with them, because the world is so small and you never know when you're going to need somebody from that side of things. And so I think whether, I'm not saying, Michelle, sending you flowers, chocolates, those types of things, but it's more around just like, you would appreciate that. Sure. But I think it's more, it's just having a relationship, having some rapport. Like Michelle, we grabbed dinner, we grabbed lunch, and it could just be as easy as an email, a text, just kind of keeping that line of communication open, because you just never know what's going to come up in 6 months, a year, or 2 years, 3 years down the road.
Yeah, actually, Daniel, you shared a lot of gems, and there's a lot to unpack there. I think that story that you talked about yesterday with the candidate that was just super persistent. If you're on one end of the spectrum, too much persistence is going to kill you. So don't do those kind of things.
Absolutely. Yes.
Don't do that.
Yeah. And that's where I will, like, with the huge asterisk of, like, I appreciate the tenacity, but it's also like, that's too far. The pushiness is too far, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And I think the other thing you pointed out was people that don't have LinkedIn Premium, you can still search who that recruiter is at the company. So that's also, that's like a really quick tip. Like, hey, if you need to find the recruiter, find them, and you don't need that premium or upgrade product. But I was going to ask you, so what was the best way, if that same candidate had followed up, what would have been the best way for them to follow up?
Yeah,
I think the ideal scenario. The
idea, rather than the adding on LinkedIn and emails and all of those kind of things.
Yeah.
That is where, and LinkedIn, this is I sound old, but I remember when LinkedIn was a job board, right? Like LinkedIn, you could not do social, you could not do messaging, you could not do all those kind of things. So LinkedIn is pretty powerful right now. Love it, hate it, wherever you are on the spectrum of LinkedIn, leverage it to the best of your ability, like reach out to those folks. And it's really nice because LinkedIn, years ago, it was just a blanket invite. Right. So Michelle, if I was connecting with you, Eric, I was connecting with you, it was just like, I would just send things into the void. But now LinkedIn makes it super easy that I can add a very high touch personal note with my invitation. So, hey, Michelle, I applied for this role. Eric, I applied for this role. I'm super interested. I'd love to connect more. I'm attaching my resume, whatever that may be. There's something along those lines. Kind of just getting across that. Sometimes it's hard. Phone numbers aren't necessarily published, but if you can find a phone number, pick up the phone and call somebody is super easy. Like we have an inbound talent inbox that folks can call, ask questions, those kind of things that we look at. But I would think that would be the best way. It's just kind of just a simple, a little, less is more, a little goes a long ways. Because I will say that like you are one of, maybe 10, 20 notifications I'm getting a day as far as like invites. And so if there's a place that kind of sets you above the rest that I can dig into that, that's what's key. And that's what I mean by that personal touch, adding that so that I know what it is rather than somebody's just kind of, because LinkedIn, don't get me wrong, people will reach out to sell us things, all of those kind of things. But if I know it's something that you're interested in the company, 9 times out of 10, I'll take a look at that depending on what it is. So,
one of the things that we recommend too, like even preceding that is, if you're able to identify the recruiter that you want to connect with, even before sending them a message, particularly if that recruiter is creating content, to engage with that content.
Absolutely.
Or, make a comment there that's that's thoughtful, not just hi. Make a comment that's thoughtful, right? And that adds some value, and you'll get on that person's radar. And then by the time you do reach out to the person, maybe with a LinkedIn message or a LinkedIn connection request, they would have seen your name already, right?
Absolutely.
And so they're more likely to give that more attention than just sort of a cold outreach. So that's one thing that we try to recommend.
That's a great call out here. And that's where even going back what I was just mentioning, right? LinkedIn, you never used to be able to do that, right? Because LinkedIn was a job board, right? And so you couldn't necessarily get on and interact with other folks in the community or the space. And so being able to leverage the tool, it's free, you have it, you don't necessarily need to have the premium if you don't want to spend the money for it, because there's so many things available at your fingertips, exactly just like that, Eric. That's a great call out.
Yeah. Oh,
go ahead, Michelle.
I was going to ask Daniel, I know you talked a little bit at a high level. I want to step back and ask a little bit about how just to give job seekers a little bit of idea of the insides in how a recruiter, how many recs are they handling at a time? How's your team look? How many messages? How many, inbound calls are you guys receiving in a day? And just, because I know a lot of people have frustrations about being ghosted, not getting response rates, like the response rates are really low. So just giving us a structure around understanding what does the load look like for you as a recruiter and your team?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's where I think it varies, I think, depending on seasonality. And what I mean by that is like, if budgets just got approved, or if companies got rounds of funding, or if something like that. So sometimes there's peaks and valleys. Generally, you will see, kind of a recruiter tip here, you will see more jobs posted at the beginning of the year, because that's when a lot of companies will focus on like, okay, we've got our budgets for the year, all of those kind of things. Will do a large source of hiring, or some companies will kind of pull it out. So all that to say, like, it varies. Rec load varies depending on the time of year. Us on average, so I have a team of 3 recruiters right now. So on average, we carry around 15 to 20-ish recs, depending on the time. And sometimes those positions have, maybe it's one, and when I say requisition or posting, so one posting, but one of those postings has 4 positions in it that we're hiring for. So we're moving folks through. So there's a lot that happens from that aspect of things, especially if, say we post, I don't know, 40 new roles at the same time. All of those positions are moving at the same time. So all of them are moving at phone screen at the same time. All of them are moving to interview stages at the same time, and so on as you move through the funnel. And so there are a lot of times where, we've experienced this, or I've experienced this as a recruiter, of sometimes we've got so many recs that some of the scheduling, I can't get to candidates for like 2 or 3 weeks out. And I get that. That is less than an ideal candidate experience. But like, with recruiting being such a human focused type role, we want to make sure that we're creating those meaningful connections and being able to connect with people. And so there are times where you may not be able to connect with a recruiter for a couple of weeks. Ideally, teams are kind of focused and what's the word I'm looking for, are like positioned correctly to kind of have conversations, and they're or that's positioned so that their recruiters can have conversations, so they're not 3 weeks out, right? I've been in that seat before. But anyway, all that saying that sometimes, recruiters, they are talking to 30 plus people a week, right? If you think about, I have 15 recs, hiring managers move candidates forward. I do a 30-minute conversation with 10 folks, right? Like that's a lot of time per week. And so there's a lot of folks that are moving through. And so I think just kind of setting yourself apart, having those conversations, sending thank you emails, sending follow-up emails, doing those types of things to kind of keep your names at the top of the list. But that is where I would say that there's a lot from that side of things around the type of recruiter, who it's and then high volume is a whole different story, right? If you're applying for a call center job, right, that there's a lot of recruiters will talk to a lot of people there. So sometimes there's a lot that gets lost in the shuffle there, or it just varies, right? But that is where it's a lot of moving parts on the recruiting backside of recruiting, that I like I said, it's the recruiting black hole, but I try to do everything I can so the candidates and my team, we're moving forward and connecting and getting back to folks as much as possible.
Yeah. So if I did the math right on this, I mean, you can have feasibly 20 racks open, job up postings, four candidates per each one. That'd be 80 people that you're managing at one time.
Moving. Absolutely.
They're interviewing. It's not even people that you rejected. It's people who are interviewing. And 80 is a lot.
Absolutely. Yes. And that's where, and even so, Michelle, if we back that up even further, so on average, we move, just from like some math throughout my career, on average, if you're, so 4 people to interview, on-site interview. So you're moving people to the panel interview stage. So say you have to, 50% of your people from phone screen move to that. And then, so that's 8 people at phone screen. So then you narrow that further down. So then if you do the math on the other side, you're narrowing down sometimes 300-400 applications to those 8, to those 4, and then so on. So it's like, that is a ton of, as you look at the funnel, it's a lot of people. Absolutely.
It's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people.
So the follow-up question is like, how do you get yourself to stand out?
Yeah.
Like, what can you do if you're the 300, 400 people in the interview process, how do you get yourself to really stand out?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there's, and I've heard this a 1,000 times in so many different ways around, like, okay, as a recruiter, I've heard 7 seconds, I've heard 10 seconds, I've heard 15 seconds. Either way, whatever it is, how do you stand out? And what I mean by those timeframes is sometimes people will say, like, you have 7 seconds to sell your resume to a recruiter, so make sure that you've got what you need. I think one recommendation or piece of advice that I always give to people is that you do not use the same resume for every single job that you're applying for. So say you're a software engineer, right? You don't have just a blanket software engineer resume that you're sending to 15 companies. You're looking at each company. Okay, I want to work for Meta. I want to work for Airbnb. I want to work for Expedia, whatever that is. And you're looking, I'm envisioning you have the job post on one side of your screen and you have your resume on the other side of your screen, and you are kind of tailoring your resume to that job post specifically. I'm not saying you're pulling things out, copying and pasting the job post to your resume, but you're pulling out keywords of like, oh yeah, I've done this. I've done that. I've done these types of things. And that's what you put near the top of your resume, because as a recruiter, as we're scanning through resumes, that's what catches our attention, is those keywords, projects that you're working on, technology stacks that we're looking for, certain types of backgrounds that we're looking for, like all of those kind of things. Just calling that out specifically, that to me goes so far, because you truly do, depending on the amount of candidates, you've got 7 to 10 seconds to kind of move through that as we're kind of glancing. And that is a quick way for me to kind of say like, okay, one, this person did their homework. And what I mean by that is like, they did not just, I'm going to cascade my resume to 50 people, right? I'm going to tailor it. I'm going to make the time. I'm interested in this company, so I'm going to do some homework. I think that, but then two, also shows that you have the skill set and the background that we need for this role as well. So that to me goes a really long ways as well.
Sounds like a resume exercise. I mean, really kind of, you're not tailoring to each 50 positions you're going after, but you want to look at what are the themes and the things you've done. Exactly. And then making sure it is in your resume, and it's at the top. It's not the bottom on the second, third, maybe fifth, 10th page. I wouldn't recommend it. Have 2 pages, 3 pages.
Me neither. I just told somebody to take their lifeguard job from high school from 15 years ago off their resume. So yes, on page 4, you don't need it. Take it off. You don't need it.
3's the max I'll look at, but I only get to second page. So that's why I was like, you don't need anything more than the first and second page.
Yeah. And sometimes not even to the second page, Michelle does. Like that's where it's kind of like, if you like, I've even seen some resumes where like most relevant experience is on the second page, and then I get lost where I'm like, what's your current role? And it's like, oh, it's down here. So most current, all of the things that you really want to highlight right at the top. Page 1. Right there.
It's like an elevator pitch. You got to really hone it in. You got to know what you stand for and what you do well. And then give it to the recruiters or the hiring manager. You got to put it at the top.
Yep.
Daniel, how does your team deal with cover letters? Are you requesting those in the applications?
So good question. And I know, hate it or love it, right? And this could be a spicy topic, but I will just say, yeah. So we do not, so my team right now, so we do not require cover letters as a part of our applications. So there's a resume portion that we want, right, that we would want to submit. And then we ask a couple of questions on the front end of our application process. So there's a portion where somebody could put in 1,000 words as to like, if that's what they wanted to put in their cover letter. But then we also ask the question around like, why this job and why this company are important to you? Like, why are you applying for this job? Because we really want, again, like I was mentioning, people that are doing their homework, that people aren't just kind of saying like, oh yeah, this job here, this job there, they're doing all of that kind of stuff. They're truly interested in doing what Recursion is doing, disrupting an industry, leveraging data, leveraging technology, and all of those kind of things, that people are truly, they are open to that and they're wanting to do that. And that's who we would want at Recursion. And so that to me weighs more than a cover letter, is just around a couple of those front end application questions more than anything. That's where we go first.
And then
I was going to say, maybe the true question is, do you read cover letters?
There is nothing, again, going back to the 7 to 10 seconds thing, I'm like, if a cover letter is like 2 pages, page and a half, I am not reading that. I will be honest with you. I am not going to read that. If it's a quick synopsis, and that's where, again, that little that it's like I have it capped at, I think at like 1,000 words or 1,500 words. That's super easy to get through. If a candidate submits something like that on the front end of their application, I'll read that. But a cover letter, I don't know. A cover letter. And then here's the other thing, talking about resumes, don't put your picture on your resume. Take your picture off your resume too. So I don't know if we're not getting into that today. That's not on our list.
Yeah, but that's an interesting
Do you see a lot of that? Do you see a lot of that?
Pictures on resumes, Eric?
Yeah.
Depending on, it's interesting, depending on the role and then where, because we have offices, we're, open, we have offices in Canada and those types of things. So depending on, and then I've recruited in like the UK before, my ancestry days, into UK, Ireland, and those types of things. And I don't know if that, again, I'm speaking to this, but like if that was I saw it a lot more in Europe than I do in the US.
Cultural
but I do
thing.
Cultural thing. Yeah. But I do tend to see it right now. Europe. Yeah. Thank you, Luther. That's what I figured. So we saw it a lot in Europe. But it's from a DEI perspective, we all have biases. We all have, as we're looking into that, I just think it's an easy way for folks to kind of say like, nope, as they're moving through that, like if you can remove your identifiers and it's just your skill set, that's the most important to me.
So quick follow-up question to that. So when one of your team members, one of your recruiters is looking at maybe an inbound application and they're looking at a resume, a lot of times people on the resume, they'll put the link to their LinkedIn profile. How are you and your team looking at LinkedIn profiles in conjunction with their application and resume, and what might they be looking for in a LinkedIn profile that maybe they're not seeing in the resume?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things our team right now as recruiters, what we look at, and I've done this throughout my career, is that we look to see if it matches up, because sometimes people may think like, oh, and I'm not saying that every candidate does this, but like, oh, there's just a little white lie I'll put on my resume that I pulled from something. But then I'm like, okay, it's on your resume, but why isn't it on your LinkedIn? Like, why aren't they one-to-one? Or like, how come titles aren't matching up and those types of things? So that's a big thing that we look at, is like, and I'm not looking word for word, I'm not looking for those types of things, but I just want to make sure that jobs are the same, titles are the same, like all of those kind of things. Some of the stuff that I'll look at on LinkedIn right away is recommendations. Recommendations are super easy to jump into and look at it like, oh, this person has this, or all of those kind of things. Or sometimes people on their resume will just put one overarching job, like their latest job. So for example, if somebody was at a company for say 10 years, they held 8 different roles, their resume may only have the last 5 years, but their LinkedIn gives me more detail. So then I'll jump to LinkedIn to kind of get a little bit more concrete details from that side of things specifically, is what I would say.
Got it.
I like Luther's questions. Tailor the bullet points on the resume. Yes. I would say yes. Eric, Michelle, what do you think?
Tailor the bullet points on the resume. Yeah.
There's a bit of a trade-off, especially now where a lot of candidates are looking at a lot of different opportunities. It's sort of that trade-off of how much do you tailor the resume to the job. What I like to recommend is at the top, and I think Michelle, you alluded to this, is at the top in your summary section, is you put 3 to 4 marquee accomplishments that are highly relevant to the job you're applying to, and that becomes like a hook to get the reader to look more at your resume. But to tweak each accomplishment across your entire resume for each job, it might be overkill, and it might be maybe an inefficient use of your time. So it's one of those things that has to be balanced, I think.
Yeah, it's like that happy, what's that happy medium, so that you don't like over index on tailoring everything to just your few things. That's a good point, Eric.
Yeah, but you definitely want to look at what jobs you're applying for and what you think is a fit, and then tailoring and making sure your resume encompasses everything. But you want to also be very succinct and detailed about what you've accomplished, because I don't like a general where the person's like highly accomplished, tech executive or marketing executive with 20 plus years and highly communicative and great at this and that, interpersonal skills and managing teams. It's like, just tell me what you've done, and tell me about your accomplishments.
Yeah. That is, Michelle, you're speaking to my recruiter heart, because because we even take this, I don't like this in job descriptions either, where folks will say like excellent communicator. Of course, right? We know we're going to need that, right? Like, I don't want to call that out specifically, or like, those types of things. Like, just tell me what's the hard, concrete kind of stuff that you've done. Yeah. That's what I want to see.
Yeah.
Too many superlatives, too many adjectives.
Yes. Buzzwords.
Buzzwords.
Yep.
So let's see. Moving on to these next questions here.
Yeah, you bet.
So how does a recruiter work with a hiring manager? Again, a lot of job seekers out there, they don't really have insight into sort of the relationship between a recruiter and a hiring manager, and even some of the other interviewers that may be part of the process. You know, is the internal recruiter typically the quarterback that's orchestrating that, or how do you guys do it there? And what have you seen, just generally speaking, as an internal recruiter?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, and I appreciate this question, Eric, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the our session today, is like one thing, throughout my entire recruiting career, I have always said a recruiter is as good as the relationships that they're creating with candidates, first and foremost, and then hiring managers. And where we're talking about hiring managers is that, I see a recruiter as like, we are a true extension of the team, the hiring manager's team. And not saying that I have to sit in on meetings, invite me to your team meetings, let me sit on the row with your folks, like all of those kind of things. But I want to know your leadership style as a hiring manager. I want to know the culture of your team. I want to know the skill gaps, the skill wins, the skill kind of all of these types of things to make sure that as a recruiter, as I'm casting this net far and wide to bring folks into you, that I am bringing you the right profile every single time. So that is where creating that relationship, having that line of communication, having some rapport, reviewing candidate profiles with hiring managers like, hey, Eric, I just found Michelle's profile. Is this what you're looking for? This is the reason why I'm setting them forward. This is the reason why I'm doing those kind of things. And we're just, we're calibrated. We are calibrating almost every single time we're moving somebody forward. So that's super important. And then with the hiring panel, partnering with the hiring manager on who we want to pull in with the panel, making sure we've got the right folks from the right backgrounds, what skill sets we want to dig into, what competencies we want to assign folks, so that it is a great candidate experience, so that a candidate's not walking into an interview. If there's 5 folks on an interview panel and the interview panelists are asking them each the same thing every single time, that we're building that out so that it's a good candidate experience. And the manager is aligned with that team to know what we're pulling in, and the team is aligned with the manager to make sure they're all aware as well. So I think, Eric, kind of what you were saying around, and I'm not a very big sports person, so hopefully quarterback is the right phrase, but like a quarterback kind of pulling that through, moving folks through, throwing the ball down the field. Like, I guess that's what we could say, right? I don't know, like kind of punting it down and making sure that things are just moving throughout so that we can win, we can get the candidate and we can move folks through. Like, that's what's most important. So yes, to answer the question is, it's very much recruiters kind of shepherding that process. And we send folks, every role that I've been in, I will send hiring managers through a training to make sure that they are setting their best foot forward and we are giving candidates an exceptional experience, because that is so important.
Yeah, that's one of the things you mentioned that several times as far as candidate experience. I think in Michelle and my experience, we've been involved with designing interview processes, right? And I think part of our job as recruiters in that case is to kind of look out for the candidate experience and in some ways enforce, maybe police is a strong word, but maybe kind of enforce and just look out for the sort of the implementation or the execution of the interview process. So for example, if we find that interviewers are cutting their interviews short by 50% in terms of the time, that could be a sort of an awkward thing that needs to be improved, right? And so we try to, as recruiters, we try to look out for these things by talking to the interviewers, but also talking to the candidates to find out what their experience is like. And so know that recruiters out there are also, they're interested in you as a candidate, but they're also interested in improving the overall process to affect the candidate experience. So any feedback you can provide as a candidate would be valuable to the recruiter about the process, because they have an interest in improving the process and making sure that the interviewers are conforming to the process. And so that's valuable for the recruiter, and that could be a good way for you to develop a rapport in a further relationship with the recruiter. So
yeah, well said, Eric. Yeah. And whether that's in a one-on-one conversation, whether that's at the end of the process, something like that. One thing that I've implemented a few times is we do candidate surveys at the end of every process. So depending on if you make it to a certain stage, I want the feedback. And the reason for that, Eric, is like that candidate experience. Like, and there are times, like my goal, we're not perfect, but I want to make sure that we're putting our best foot forward. And there are some times where we slip, and I want to know kind of where we've slipped and what that feedback is so that we can do better for the future. Like that is so important to me. So absolutely. I like that, Eric. Just kind of that open dialogue and that two-way street, really key from that side.
So the follow-up question here is, why don't candidates talk to hiring managers first? Why is it often that a candidate's talking to a recruiter? Why is the sequence like that?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I think kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier around volume, like hiring managers, if we look at, let's use like a software engineer, right? I'm hiring a software engineer, the software engineering manager, like their role is not like, there's a piece of their role that we want to partner with, we want to do some hiring, but to sort through that many candidates that are applying, having that many interviews, that's a full-time job on top of a full-time job, right? There is a lot of collaboration between recruiters and hiring managers around, like, I've seen it sometimes where me as a recruiter, I feel like I'm dialed in on the profile of your team. I feel like I know what I'm looking for. I'll screen through resumes, and then I'll move your best people forward. Or as a hiring manager, say, Eric, say you're my hiring manager, I'll jump into the system and I'll move my best people forward based on a resume screen to you, Daniel, to talk with, and then you move them to me. So I've seen both sides. So it really just depends. I've also seen it where some managers do talk to candidates first, to kind of get that initial conversation, to make sure the skill set's there, to make sure if it's a certain technology, they can dig into that way more than I can. I'm the first to say, like, I'm not technical, I'm not I'm not a scientist, I'm not on the bench, I'm not doing those kind of things. So if a manager wants to dig into that, absolutely. But as a recruiter, I want to talk through compensation expectations. I want to talk through, if the role requires relocation, if the role, would you be a culture addition into the organization? Like all of those types of things. That is our job as a recruiter, is to kind of shepherd that process and take that burden off of the hiring manager so that they can focus on their day to day, and that we're going to tee up their best folks to move forward in the process from a candidate perspective.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Makes sense.
So I wanted to actually ask about, move into a little bit of the D&I side of things.
Sure.
I know we're also kind of probably going to be bumping up against time. I want to give our audience a chance to ask.
Michelle, yeah. I had a feeling.
I know we've got a lot to talk about, and we can keep talking.
There'll be part 2. Yes,
with our ugly sweater party. So we promise that. And then I also want to give it an opportunity to answer some of these questions from the audience. So let's leave the last 5 minutes for that. But I do want to ask about just D&I, and how does that tie into, what is D&I? How does that tie into recruiting, and how does that affect the job seeker?
Yeah, absolutely. So DEI, so you'll hear DEI, you'll hear DEIB, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, or diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. I always like to say, people hear me say this, like inclusion and diversity, because you have to have an inclusive environment before you can get diversity. And so a lot of folks may think like, oh, we'll just hire diverse backgrounds and then our company is inclusive, right? And it's the other way. Like if you want folks to stay, or if you want folks to even engage in your process, you have to have an inclusive process to attract diversity. So I think how that impacts the process, one thing I will say is, like, there's a lot of conversation right now around like comp expectations, right? So like, should I tell a recruiter my comp expectations? Should I not tell my recruiter my comp expectations? And one thing I will just say from a diversity equity standpoint is that, yes, talk about comp expectations with your recruiter, because that is one of the biggest things. And make sure that you are going to a company where they're transparent about their comp expectations, or their comp bands and salaries and all of those kind of things. Because as you're looking at you want to be paid a comp philosophy, you want to be working in a role. If candidate A and candidate B are doing the same job, we're going to pay them the exact same. That's the way it should be. Is that if they're doing the same role, if they're doing the same thing, they need to be being paid the exact same, right? Senior, that's a different, as you're moving up the level, like all of those kind of things. But if it's the exact same job, doing the exact same thing, you should be paid that. And so there's a big piece around comp expectations, talking about that with your recruiter from a DEI lens. Absolutely. As you're kind of focusing on that, where it comes into the candidate process is that there's a lot around, I think it was Google, and I could have my stories wrong, but like 10 years ago, Google got into some hot water where they were doing their DEI lens and they overcorrected and they were discriminated against certain groups. And so they were, how do you kind of narrow that through? One thing I will always say is like, we will hire the right person for the right role every single time. We will make sure that as recruiters, we're doing outreach, we're pulling in diverse backgrounds, we're pulling in folks, and then we're moving them through based on background, based on skill set, and all of those kind of things. But I will also take a look at the recruiting funnel to ensure that it is equitable at every step. And what I mean by that is like, say I pull in X amount of this group, X amount of this group, X amount of this group, but this whole group fell out at this step in the process. What's wrong? What happened? Like that should be, why did that happen? Is our process discriminatory? Is it somehow overcorrecting this way? And so like, we'll take a look at every step of that to move folks through and just making sure that it's equitable at every single way through the process. And so those are just a couple of things that I think come into play that I think the right person for the right role every single time. And one thing I will say is I've heard a lot of things around like, oh, I only check like 7 out of 10 boxes, or like, I don't hit every single thing on this job requirements list. Apply anyway, right? If you've got 7 out of 10, if you've got 8 out of 10, throw your name in that hat, because if there's an opportunity for you, it's out there. And that is a great way to kind of just, I'm going to do this. And you want to work for a company that kind of puts their best foot forward, and they're doing that from comp. They're doing that from an equity inclusion. They've got ERGs. They've got all of those kind of things. That is so important, especially like not right now. It's always been important, but it's the right thing to do. So that's,
Daniel, what are the biggest sort of misconceptions or misunderstandings that you see as it relates to DEI and how it might be incorporated into sort of the hiring or interviewing processes?
Yeah, I think some of the stuff that, again, going back to that Google thing, right? You'll hear around people like, oh, I'm only moving forward because of this, or they only interviewed me because of this, or I didn't get interviewed because of this. And it's whether, depending on what company you're at or what you've interviewed for, like, I can't speak to all of those. I can just speak to my experiences that every company I've worked for, like we are looking at it from an equitable lens. We are making sure that we're putting that through, but that's some of the misconceptions I've heard, is that some folks may use it. And that's where I go back to my other question or my other comment around pictures on resumes and those types of things. It's like humans, it's human nature. We all have our own biases. Whether folks want to say they don't or not, we do. The science has proven that we do have our own biases. And so whether that's a background, a picture, or something like that, that automatically is coming up. So like, what are ways that we can kind of hide that? And I'm not saying hide like it's a bad thing, but that we block that. We're blocking bias is what I meant to say. So we're blocking bias so that folks and candidates, it's the right role, it's the right skill set. And that's what we're hiring people based on.
Awesome. There is a question in the audience, and this is actually, I'm curious about this. So talking about D&I, someone is a white male with no disabilities, no veteran status. Are they better off leaving all those questions as declined to answer, or just answer them anyway? Does that affect them if they just decline to answer?
Yeah, my answer to that question is we don't see those. So we put those come into an aggregate. When I pull up an application, I am not looking at those and saying like, okay, Michelle marked this, Eric marked this, I'm going to move Eric forward instead. Like that all goes into an aggregate, and we look at it to kind of say like, okay, X amount of people here applied, X amount of people here didn't apply. How do we kind of match those numbers? It does not tie it. Most systems that I've been in do not tie it to a certain person. It goes into an aggregate. So I always recommend answer them however you would prefer, but just know that they do not get tied to decisions from that side of things.
Okay, that's always good to know.
So in other words, it wouldn't put you at an advantage or disadvantage by answering those questions.
No. I always prefer them because I'm data driven, so I want to know where the data's at. So then I can look at the picture from a whole, but I'm not looking at it from a 1-to-1 ratio, if that makes sense. And hopefully I answered that okay. Yeah.
So should we go ahead? There are a couple other questions in the audience.
Sure.
So one of them was, how does one attract the eyes of a recruiter? And I think this was directed to Eric and Daniel. I've never worked with one, therefore I don't know how it all works. And can we get a step-by-step? And we might have answered some of these, but.
Yeah, in-house Eric, do you want to talk about that from like external?
So I can talk about that briefly from an external perspective. So I think the big part is trying to identify which recruiters it would make sense for you to connect with, right? Not all recruiters, not all external recruiters are equal, right? A lot of them tend to specialize either by region or by domain or industry or sector, even company size. So even profession, like there's some recruiters that only recruit nurses, for example, right? So you have to make sure that you're connecting with the right recruiter. And then in terms of how do you connect with the recruiter, once you identify the right type of recruiter you're trying to connect with, typically I would imagine you'd probably be on LinkedIn to try to find these folks. Like I mentioned earlier, if you can, a lot of times you want to connect with folks that, if they're producing content, engage with their content first, your name will start to show up and they'll be more likely to recognize your name when you reach out to them coldly. Or it wouldn't be cold at that point, but because you've already engaged with them. So reach out to them on LinkedIn after you've engaged with their content in a meaningful way. That works on me, right? People have done that to me. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I remember so-and-so. Okay. So I'm more likely to respond to them in a compelling way, not just a sort of a generic way. So that would be probably my biggest thing, and just being consistent about that. And eventually you'll connect. I mean, also tap into your network. I mean, if you know somebody that has worked with a great recruiter that they would endorse and recommend, try to see if they can make an introduction. So those probably be the big things I would recommend.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think the world is so small, right? I'm not saying we're all connected in those kind of things, but odds are, depending on the sector, the space, the location, somebody may know somebody in the recruiting space that you can get a connection that way too.
Yeah. One thing I'll also say is your recruiter is not going to be your savior.
True. Yes.
We
don't know everything. We don't know it all. Yeah.
Yeah. And you have to temper your expectations. Even if you do connect with a recruiter, I mean, I'm a recruiter and I wish I had endless jobs I could just dole out to people. I wish.
Absolutely. Yes.
But I don't. And so you have to temper your expectations about what you can expect from a recruiter. A great way to leverage a recruiter is to validate your candidate market fit, right? Is to validate maybe your comp range, right? Maybe to validate or give you some guidance around how you could approach a situation. That's a great way to partner with and leverage a recruiter. But just to, have them send you 10 job openings that are the perfect fit for you, or make introductions with all the hiring managers they know, it's unlikely. So you have to temper your expectations. And I think the point is you need to be your own recruiter. Yep. You have to be your own recruiter.
Yes. And that's even pulling just back to what I was mentioning about LinkedIn. You don't have to pay for it to use some of, obviously you can't search in those, like the big searches, but you can still leverage the tool. And LinkedIn's not the only one either. So there's a lot of options out there.
Yeah. I guess, Daniel, do you have any thoughts or anything that you want to kind of add in terms of, kind of attracting the eyes of recruiter? I think you did mention just,
the tailoring the resume, reaching out on LinkedIn, doing those kind of things. But Eric, I will just echo what you said around, like, even though we're connected, like we can only do so much, but I think it's still kind of just having that partnership. And if it's not now, again, pulling through what I was with Michelle, like if it's not now, it could be 3 years down the road and the rest is history. You could be on a podcast with somebody in 5 years from when you first met them. So you never know.
Yeah. And I know Melanie had a question about just us reading cover letters, Eric and Michelle. We don't read, I don't personally read cover letters, coming from just getting a flood of candidates that apply. I just don't have time for it. So my first go-to is I'll take a quick look at the first like third or half of the section of the resume. And then I will take a look at their LinkedIn profile. So those are the two that I would go to pretty quickly within those 7 seconds, 10 seconds, and make a pretty quick decision if I want to talk to that person.
The problem with cover letters is that 99% of the time they're generic. And so I think a lot of recruiters have been trained not to read them because they know how generic they are.
Yep.
Yeah. No, they usually are pretty generic. And I want to address one last question, because I think Luther, you had kind of a question about this, but so you wrote that you're an executive in professional services for many years and led technology projects for Fortune 500 clients. So last 4 years, CTO as a startup. Could I pivot to a position at a publicly traded tech firm? So i.e. engineering management / director role? And if so, how do I position myself on my resume and cover letter so as not to get it discarded in the first few seconds? So this is related to candidate market fit. Daniel, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think kind of just pulling through cover letter, what we were just mentioning, like cover letter, I would not spend a ton of time on a cover letter. Doing some of those things, Luther, just looking at your question and kind of some of your background, depending on that engineering management director role, pull some of that stuff that you've done in your CTO role, pull some of that stuff that you've done in your the professional services aspect of your career that highlight into those roles, right? Maybe you have a resume that's, you want to be a CTO again. So you've got a CTO resume, and then you've got this engineering management director type resume that it's not discounting your experience as a CTO, but you're pulling different things in and it's written just a little bit differently so that you're attracting the attention of that recruiter that's looking for that role specifically, is what I would say.
Yeah, it's a good point of having two separate sort of specialized resumes. I mean, making a pivot's tough. It really is.
Hard.
I mean, you have to dig deep. You have to dig deep into your experience and really figure out what's portable, and then how to position it as such. I would imagine that, I guess for many years, so most of your experience has been with Fortune 500 clients, but I think that to the extent that you can sort of even out your experience or emphasize your experience such that it's not purely startup, because that might be held against you, because some companies, if they look at sort of a track record of only working with small companies, they might ask themselves, oh, well, will this person fit into a bigger company? That's one of the things that crosses the minds of recruiters when they're looking at somebody's background. So maybe something to keep in mind.
But if it is a startup, then I would be looking for people who have worked in smaller environments, not all complete large companies. So, well, I think we need to wrap up. I know we're way past time.
We had fun though. We had fun.
Yeah. Hopefully the audience, you guys had fun and learned something out of this. I know there's a lot of wisdom here. So maybe as a kind of a question for Daniel, how can people best connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that push, like LinkedIn, so we'll post this. I think this will go on Spotify and all of those kind of things, but like we're on LinkedIn right now, but it's just my last name, Benavides Daniel. So linkedin.com /Benavides Daniel is where I'm at. So
I'll drop it in the comments.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle. But yeah, happy to connect. Always happy to have conversations with folks too. So
yeah. And I know in the beginning we mentioned, we have that special with $99 for resume review and $99 for mock interviews. So I will drop that in the chat. And for those who want to sign up or whatnot, you can join our mailing list as well. So you can keep updated with all the upcoming webinars. We will do more of these for sure. And with you, Daniel. And awesome. We'll share some wisdom tips and, reach out to us on LinkedIn as well if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Appreciate your time.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Happy holidays.
Bye, y'all.
Okay. Bye.